So my title is The Return of the Activist State, Promise and Perils. And so what do I mean by return? Right now, the air is thick all over the Western world with talk of industrial policy is back. Just as, for example, Mariano Mazzucato in the Financial Times just a few days ago began her piece called Industrial Strategy is Experiencing a Renaissance. But even in the IMF, there is talk of the return of industrial policy, as in, for example, this coy title of a working paper published in 2019 by Hasanoff and Sharif, The Return of the Policy That Shall Not Be Named. So you see from that title just how toxic is this phrase, industrial policy. And of course, right now, the US is making the biggest push into industrial policy since the Second World War, as in what is misleadingly called the Inflation Reduction Act, which stands to allocate almost $400 billion to subsidize the green transition, and then on top of that, another $100 billion in the United States to boost US capacity to make semiconductors and to spread broadband access around the country. So this is quite a major change in the whole environment of public policy. So let me just spend a minute spelling out what I mean by industrial policy. Industrial policy means actions taken by the state intended to change the existing composition of economic activity in the economy by favoring some activities, some sectors ahead of others, in line with an economy-wide, and that's important, an economy-wide, not sector-specific, economy-wide exercise in foresight about the economy's future growth and the economy's dependence on other states, other suppliers. So let me just give some examples of what I meant to say when I said a minute ago that industrial policy has long been a toxic phrase. I worked in the World Bank in the 1980s and 1990s, and you really could not use this phrase inside the World Bank except possibly in a negative way. So the standard reply, and critics in the United States are now saying, in response to the Biden administration's initiatives in industrial policy, the critics are now saying this is a bad mistake. Why? Because, and this is the standard aphorism that is used to reject industrial policy, the government cannot pick winners, period. So as an example, Gary Becker, 1985, the best industrial policy is none at all. I understand that a prominent Polish minister of the economy in the early 1990s used to go around saying this same phrase, the best industrial policy is none at all, as though it was his own phrase. It was not his own phrase, it was Gary Becker's. I've been to Georgia, and there too, quite recently, the minister of the economy goes around saying the best industrial policy is none at all, as though it's his own phrase. It's not, it's Gary Becker, 1985. Here's Michael Boskin. He was advisor to the George Bush government, saying, potato chips, semiconductor chips, what is the difference? They're all chips. $100 worth of one or $100 worth of the other is still $100. So we needn't worry whether our economy is concentrated in potato chips or semiconductors. You may be amazed at these statements. Let me give a few more examples. This is Herbert Stein. Herbert Stein was the chair of the US Council of Economic Advisors. And this is what he said in the same kind of spirit. He said, if the most efficient way for the US to get steel is to produce tapes of Dallas, the television program Dallas, and sell those tapes to the Japanese, then producing tapes of Dallas is our basic industry. So forget about steel, let the Japanese do the steel, we'll make the tapes of Dallas, and everybody will be happy, as he said. So here's another example. So Terence Burns, who was the chief economic advisor during the Thatcher years in Britain, who said, if we can't make money manufacturing things, we'd better think of something else to do. What's the problem? And so on. And in the paper that I've written for this conference, I've given quite a number of more examples of this same kind of basically neoliberal thinking. And so, yes, as I say here, the critics of the Biden administration say that if the government gets it wrong with these bets, then, and this is the quote from the New York Times, the United States may surrender its leadership in key technologies for good. But what the critics don't say is that if the government does not take these initiatives, it may also surrender its leadership in these technologies for good, or almost for good. So there's no balance in what the critics are saying. So let me give you a reference to a paper, a new paper published in August called The Who, What, When, and How of Industrial Policy. And this paper reports the results of a very elaborate study of a huge database, an English language database of economic policy produced by the Global Trade Alert. And the data goes from 2009 to 2020, so 11 years. And I'm going to summarize the conclusions of this elaborate paper. The first conclusion is that the use of industrial policy increased over the period from 2009 to 2020, from some 20% of total policies in the sample to nearly 50% of the in the sample in 2019. So there's a very big increase in the use of industrial policy. We can talk in the discussion, if you like, as to how exactly they identified what is an industrial policy instrument from other instruments, but I won't go into that now. The second important conclusion from this paper is that the wealthy liberal democracies, that is, the democracies that were in the top income quintile in this whole sample of countries, a large number of countries, they made more use of industrial policy than countries in the lower income quintiles. In other words, industrial policy has been used increasingly in the wealthy countries, quite contrary to our normal assumptions about how developing countries use more industrial policy than the wealthy countries. And the third conclusion is that industrial policy mostly takes the form of subsidies, including subsidies to promote import replacement and for export promotion measures, which may include subsidies, may include concessional credit, for example, as distinct from import tariffs. Not much use of import tariffs in the context of industrial policy these days. And in many countries, these measures, subsidies and export promotion measures, are targeted at quite narrow subsectors. For example, batteries for automobiles in China, and even targeted in some cases at specific firms. The fourth conclusion is that industrial policies tend to be targeted at a small number of industries, this is in each economy, in which the country already has an international presence, with the aim of expanding that presence. So in my terminology, this is a case of state followership of the market. That is a case of the state making bets on initiatives that the private sector has already started to undertake in order to accelerate movement in those same directions. That's what I mean by state followership of the market as a type of industrial policy. But of course, the fact that most of these initiatives are of the state followership kind does not mean that industrial policy to promote activities that are not already underway is not important. And that is what I call state leadership of the market. So I'm making a distinction between state followership of the market, which is the state betting on initiatives that have already been started or are about to be started by a private initiative, the state taking bets on some of those to accelerate them. That's state followership, and state leadership of the market, where the state takes the initiative in getting into activities that the private sector is not already in. Both of these constitute industrial policy. Okay, so let me just, okay. So that's what I mean by industrial policy. Today, of course, the whole context of industrial policy as of the past decade or so is different from what it was before, because geopolitics is back and it's in the economy, so that all trade and industrial policy issues have to be or have become deeply weaponized, and this fact has to be taken into account in governments that are formulating trade and industrial policy for their economies. The world seems to be moving towards regional blocs, and specifically a US-led regional bloc and a China-led bloc, and with European countries and companies navigating uncomfortably in between. So the implications of this return of geopolitics into the economy. First of all, investment criteria have to change. Criteria of investment in the state and in individual companies. The criteria can no longer be based on least cost per unit locations. And I'm comparing that point with the aphorism attributed to Jack Welch, who was the CEO of General Electric, who said in 1986, business would like to put every factory on a barge, meaning put every factory on a barge and then simply float the barge to wherever was a least cost per unit location in terms of labor costs, in terms of environmental costs, and so on. So that kind of logic now is it has to be seriously qualified. The second implication of geopolitics in the economy is that criteria of resilience of supply, of just-in-case sourcing with built-in redundancy now has to weigh more heavily in investment decisions than it did before, both with respect to states and with respect to companies. So, for example, the case of Germany. Germany is now alarmed by its dependence on cheap Russian gas, as everybody knows. But Germany is also alarmed by its dependence on China, and that dependence on Germany's dependence on China is magnitudes more complicated than its dependence on Russia, in particular because millions of jobs in Germany depend on exports to China, and many depend directly on exports to China, and many more millions depend indirectly on exports to China. But also jobs in Germany depend on imports from China. And so an example of all this geopolitics coming into German calculations, COSCO, the state-owned shipping company, the question is whether it can buy 25% of a container handling terminal in Hamburg. The worry in Germany and in the West, and especially in the United States, is that if COSCO were to get 25% equity in this container handling terminal, it would be able to bring the Chinese Navy into Hamburg, and that might not be very welcome in European and indeed American circles. I understand that there is agreement, Andreas can say, that China will go ahead and buy a large stake, but it will be less than 25%, and therefore it will not have a determining influence in what happens in that container port, but it will go ahead and buy a less than 25% share. And another thing that's happening, complicating all German calculations, China is now replacing many imports which were previously imported from Germany, so that Germany's long-time trade surplus with China is now turning into a widening deficit. And then overarching all these problems is the question, what is Germany's reaction going to be if China invades Taiwan? And given that about 98% of the Taiwanese population say they do not want to be politically integrated with the mainland, it's unlikely that China will get control of Taiwan without an invasion. And the really hot question is, will this invasion take place within the next several years or not? And how will Germany, amongst all the other Western countries, respond if that happens? Singapore is another case in point. Singapore is trying to play both sides of this decoupling so that Chinese companies and Western companies are rushing to establish offices in Singapore so as to be able to navigate from Singapore into this polarizing business environment. So let me say now something about the principles of industrial policy. We've not actually been talking about this so far in this conference. And I'm going to give just 3 rules of thumb, so to speak, rules of thumb about how to do industrial policy, and then I'll go on to give a very schematic model, a model of the institutional arrangements of an effective developmental state. So the principles of industrial policy are suggested by in this paper that I showed you before by Hasanoff and Sharif. It's an IMF working paper published in 2019. And the first principle, the state should selectively encourage promising activities at or near the economy's technology frontier. Second rule of thumb, selective firms should be encouraged to export early on. When they receive subsidies, when they receive concessional credit, that should go with conditions that they at least begin pushing into export markets. But, and this is a key point that I really want to emphasize, and it comes from my own research in Northeast Asia, in Northeast Asian trade regimes. This is Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Export promotion is not necessarily counter to import replacement. And I say that as somebody who worked in the World Bank, in the trade policy division of the World Bank. And this statement that I've just shown you, export promotion is not counter to import replacement, that statement would have been heretical when I was working in the trade policy division, because you were not allowed in the World Bank at that time to say anything good about import replacement. You could say good things about export promotion, so everybody was wanting to know how to encourage developing countries to increase exports, but not at all how to marry up export promotion with import replacement. And yet, in Northeast Asia, all these countries were very actively integrating these two parts of trade policy. Export promotion was integrated with import replacement. And the metaphor that I coined to describe this process is that export promotion and import replacement are like the two wings of the same bird. For example, just as one illustration of this linkage, trade protection for domestic market sale yields supernormal profits that can be then used, or the state can require those supernormal profits to be used for subsidizing entry into export markets. And this is what the North Koreans did, sorry, not the North Koreans, the South Koreans did with Hyundai. For example, they protected the domestic car market so that Hyundai got supernormal profits on the domestic sales, and then Hyundai was required to use those supernormal profits to subsidize export prices. That was the mechanism that was used. And there are other ways of making this integration. This, I think, is a really important point because it allows export promotion to go with the process of deepening the domestic industrial structure, filling in the domestic input-output table. And the third point is that the industrial policy assistance does not necessarily insulate the promoted firms from international competitive pressures. Always in the context of protection, trade protection, the argument against trade protection is that insulates firms from international competitive pressures. But that need not be the case, and Northeast Asia shows how it need not be the case, because the assistance can be given against performance conditions. It must be given against performance conditions so that you do not get the situation of the Indian automobile industry, which from the 1950s to the early 1990s, when it was heavily protected, kept replicating British 1955 automobile technology. It kept replicating it because there was no incentive, because it was completely insulated from international competitive pressures. The automobile industry in India really only began to be encouraged when there was an opening to foreign domestic firms. And I know all about this because I lived in India in the 1970s and 80s, and I suffered from having to go around in these terrible, terrible Indian ambassador automobiles which replicated 1955 British engineering technology. So my point is that performance conditions have to be given against industrial policy assistance, and there are various ways of doing that. It can be done. The producers can be under pressure to move their products up towards the international, not up, but to move their prices in the direction of imported prices and in the direction of imported quality. Now, let me just, this is coming towards the end. I want to run over a very schematic model of institutional arrangements of the capitalist developmental state. This is very schematic. So, parts of the state have to have an entrepreneurial mindset or a venture capital mindset. And that's the first key point. There should be an agency at the top of government, not far away on the periphery of government, but up near the top of government, which is responsible for formulating a national plan based on the exercise of economy-wide foresight that no single company or sector has an incentive to do. The emphasis there is economy-wide foresight about the future. Then going on, this agency must design and deploy instruments to impart what I call directional thrust to the economy's growth, directional thrust in an environmentally sustainable way. And then sometimes, this is going back to the distinction I made before, sometimes the state places bets on activities already begun at private initiative in private firms, and that means the state following the market, but trying to accelerate the moves of private firms in certain sectors of the economy, but not others. And then sometimes the state exercises leadership, taking initiatives that the private sector has not already embarked on. And sometimes the state, and in fact most often, the state is simply hands-off, maybe regulating for antitrust or something like that, but not actually trying to encourage in a selective way. So going on from this, a small elite state bureaucracy, which is close to the top of government, which chooses the activities to be promoted and chooses the best way to do so, and supervises competition in the strategic sectors, number one. Two, and quite controversially, a political system in which the bureaucracy has sufficient scope, especially this agency, the elite state bureaucracy up at the top. The bureaucracy has sufficient scope to operate effectively with limited interference from the legislature and from the judiciary. And so in the phrase of Chalmers Johnson, who wrote a celebrated book called Miti and the Japanese Miracle, published in 1982, in his phrase, in this model of the developmental state, politicians reign, like Queen Elizabeth reigns, but bureaucrats rule. And going on, there are a whole range of agencies and forums for steering the market in the developmental state. For example, forums to bring together public and private representatives to exchange views. And you might even regard this particular forum today as a kind of prototype forum for a developmental state. This is the kind of forum in which private and public representatives exchange views, but in a way that ensures that the public bureaucrats cannot be corrupted as a result of their interactions with the private sector. Let me see. I want to emphasize this point. The state conducted R&D and state finance for private sector R&D. So this gives me the opportunity to emphasize a point I made earlier today, that there has to be, with these subsidies, with this concessional credit, there has to be built in a risk-reward mechanism, just like a venture capitalist has a contract with the firms to which the capitalist is investing, a contract in which the venture capitalist gets back some share of the profits that result from that venture capitalist's investment in that firm. Gets back, so this is the risk-reward mechanism. This is the risk-reward mechanism, and that has to be built into all state industrial policy, all state assistance for particular firms. And then the revenues that come back to the state through this risk-reward mechanism are themselves not put into the general budget of the state, but are put into a budget to encourage further innovation in the domestic economy. And I'll just mention also the last one, fiscal investment incentives targeted at the production frontier. So this is based particularly on my research in Taiwan. Taiwan has for decades an elaborate system of fiscal investment incentives. And these incentives are made available for the producers of particular products that the government wishes to encourage. But let's say electrical transformers, for example. A producer of electrical transformers can get significant tax reductions as a result of producing electrical transformers. But this is the key point. Not all electrical transformers, only electrical transformers, this is in any one time, above a certain level of capacity. So the incentives are targeted at the frontier of production in Taiwan. So only a few firms, maybe only just one or two firms, which are able to meet this level of capacity of electrical transformers, only they can get access to these incentives, which gives then other firms an incentive to keep upgrading their electrical transformers in order to get access to these subsidies. And over time, as more and more firms are able to meet that level of capacity of electrical transformers, then the standard itself is raised, so as to keep it targeted at the frontiers of production in Taiwan. These are significant incentives. And every year, the government publishes long lists of products with quite detailed specifications about performance. which are eligible for a number of fiscal investment incentives. And one of the good things about that whole system is that it involves no discretion on the part of bureaucrats. Bureaucrats are not deciding whether to give the incentive to this firm or whether not to give it to the firm. Any firm that can show that it produces electrical transformers above a certain level of capacity automatically gets the incentives. So that is a way of reducing corruption, the inevitable corruption around industrial policy. So let me now just conclude briefly. We're in a world where supply chains are being weaponized. This is a new word in the English language, weaponized, and you see it everywhere now, weaponized. So the weaponization of supply chains is intensifying, and policymakers must refine their lists of critical supply chains and take action to reduce the vulnerability of producers and buyers in chips and energy and antibiotics, other key pharmaceuticals, protective medical equipment, and a number of other things. And to do this kind of exercise, policymakers have to think intensively, as they were not thinking before, about the input-output structure of their economies, and to build on the non-neoclassical economics insight, because this insight has no place in neoclassical economics, that economic development is activity-specific. So quite contrary to what Boskin and Herbert Stein and so on said, as though making potato chips is the same as making computer chips as long as you can get the same revenue. I mean, that is the neoclassical view, and that is completely wrong. The correct understanding is that economic development is activity-specific. You better be in computer chips and not in potato chips, because computer chips have a much higher potential for growth and technological improvement and backwards and forwards linkages than potato chips do. And all this realization, which is coming quite suddenly and quite recently, I think could be counted on as an upside to COVID and to the new Cold War. And we desperately need some upsides to these terrible times that we are in. Thank you.